during which they prophesied. So we're going to begin with Hosea. During the period of certain kings, which are actually identified in Hosea chapter 1 and verse 1. If you'll look at Hosea 1 verse 1, and we'll kind of use this to illustrate the chart, he makes reference to the kings, those kings being Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, who were kings of Judah. So if you'll look at the row that lists the kings of Judah, you'll see Uzziah there, who began reigning in about the year 767. And then you've got Jotham, you can see him next, Ahaz, and then Hezekiah. And some of these kings are more familiar to us than others. Probably Hezekiah, among the kings of Judah, would be the one with which we're most familiar. He was one of the better kings, and it was also during his time that the Assyrians attacked the city of Jerusalem. And I think everybody likes this story. Hezekiah went and he prayed to God about the Assyrians, and God defeated the Assyrians so that they were not able to attack the city, and God did that by way of one angel. One angel killed or put to death 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in one night. So that chart, I think, is very helpful. You also may want to consider, and this is outlined in the introductory material, reading the portions of the Old Testament that pertain to the period of the minor prophets. That'll, again, help you learn more about the history that took place. There are also key dates in Bible chronology, and that's on the next page on the right-hand side. He has, beyond that, the next page, you'll see the Old Testament. On the left side, the periods of history and the books of the Bible that relate to those different periods. So you've got the patriarchal, the wilderness wanderings, conquest of the promised land, so forth and so on. How many of you don't have a workbook? Okay. We ordered a lot of workbooks, more than there are people here tonight. Again, workbooks just kind of have feet of their own and a way to walk out the door. But anyway, well, you're just going to have to use your imagination. And I will order, it looks like I need about maybe 15 more, maybe 20. So I'll have those by next Wednesday night. But there's a list of the major events that took place during the Old Testament period. And then you see the Old Testament broken down on this page. And he gives the arrangement of the books of the Bible in the Hebrew Bible, the original arrangement, but then the English arrangement. There's not a lot of difference, but there is some. So let's just kind of get to the questions here in Lesson 1. In what section of the Hebrew Bible would one find the minor prophets? Well, I'm going to go ahead and answer that for you since a lot of you don't have it, and I don't even know that this matters. But it's the latter section in the Hebrew. It's L-A-T-T-E-R, the latter prophets, and that would be Hosea through Malachi. Second question, why are these prophets referred to as minor prophets? I touched upon this in my lesson Sunday morning. They're just smaller books. You know, you could probably spend all your life never studying this subject, and when you hear major prophets and minor prophets, you're going to think, well, the major prophets were more important than the minor prophets. But they weren't. They're just bigger books. And again, as I said Sunday morning, the reason I like studying the minor prophets is because they're more easily digested. You know, you get through them pretty quick. Some of them are very short. In fact, some of them are just one chapter. And the message can be much more easily grasped and understood as compared to studying 66 chapters in the book of Isaiah. But be aware of the fact that the major prophets and the minor prophets didn't prophesy in separate periods of time. There is some overlap. In fact, if you go back to that chronological chart of kings and prophets, you can see, for example, if you'll put your finger on Hosea, there were other prophets who were contemporary with Hosea. Among the minor prophets would have been Jonah and Amos, and then Isaiah would have been a contemporary with Hosea as well. Some of these prophets prophesied primarily to the northern kingdom. Others prophesied primarily to the southern kingdom. Hosea is going to be a prophet who is prophesying to the northern kingdom. Now, if you'll look also back at the chronological chart, and we're going to be looking at some of these dates in just a moment, if Hosea prophesied somewhere around 750-ish BC and continued into the time of Hezekiah. Well, it was in 721 BC that the Assyrians fell to the Babylonians. So it was during the period when he was prophesying that this took place. So this was a hard time. That's the point I'm trying to make politically. If you're working in the northern kingdom of Israel, the kingdom is becoming weaker and weaker. It's a very sinful kingdom. There were no good kings in the northern kingdom of Israel. None. There were bad kings and there were worse kings. Literally every king followed in the steps of Jeroboam I. They worshiped the golden calves that he erected in Dan and Bethel to keep the Jews in the northern kingdom from going back and worshiping in Jerusalem and possibly defecting from the northern kingdom. That was his way of keeping his people. He instituted a false system of worship. But the kingdom is rapidly approaching its end. So keep that in mind as we get into the book of Hosea. Question 3, what is the essential idea through general usage of the Hebrew word nabi that is translated prophet? Well, a prophet, I'll just go ahead and answer this for you. A prophet is an authorized spokesman. A prophet is an authorized spokesman. Someone read Exodus chapter 7 and verse 1. Read for us Exodus chapter 7 and verse 1. This is a good verse of Scripture that I guess illustrates how the Bible can define terms in a way that we can understand. Someone read Exodus chapter 7 and verse 1. Okay, so what reluctance did Moses have when God called him? He said, "I'm not eloquent," and I won't say he used that as his excuse. I think it was probably true, and so God said, "Your brother, you will be God to Pharaoh, and your brother will be the prophet." So his brother Aaron was going to be the spokesperson. He was going to be the authorized spokesperson, even though Moses was the one sent by God to deliver the Israelites from Egyptian bondage. So when you think of a prophet then, you think of an authorized spokesman who was both a forth-teller as well as a foreteller. What do I mean when I say they were both forth-tellers and foretellers? What do I mean by that? Okay. Okay. A forth-teller, a prophet revealed God's will. He also would speak of future events, so he was a foreteller. Typically, when people think of prophets, they always think about someone who's speaking of the future. But some of the prophets, in fact, I'm going to step out on a limb and say this, most of the prophecies were God revealing his will through these spokespersons, with less actually being foretelling of future events. It's mixed in with the message that God had for the people. But most of it was the message that God had for the people at that time. And the reason God sent the prophets was to turn the people back to himself, because they were becoming unfaithful. They were becoming very sinful. Had they not sinned, then the primary purpose of the prophet probably then would have been just to foretell of future events. Give the significant historical event that took place on these dates. That's question 5. Well, 721 BC, I've already made reference to this. That's the fall of Samaria, which was the capital of the northern kingdom, to Assyria and the exile of the northern kingdom. So the northern kingdom went into captivity, Assyrian captivity, before the southern kingdom went into Babylonian captivity. 597 BC, that was the fall of Jerusalem to Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. So this was leading up to the time of the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, which took place in the year 586 BC. In 520 BC, Haggai and Zechariah were sent, they're prophets, and we'll be studying those books of prophecy. They were sent to stir up the people to resume work on the temple. When the Jews returned from Babylonian captivity, Cyrus was the Persian king who issued the edict which allowed the Jews to return from captivity. Some did, some didn't. Think about Ezra and Nehemiah. Those are two books written by men who were leaders during that period of return from Babylonian exile. Nehemiah, what was Nehemiah's function? You remember? Rebuild the walls around, all right, rebuild the walls around the city, rebuild the walls around the temple. Ezra was sent primarily to teach the law. He was one who had much learning in the scriptures. So God was making provision for the people who came out of exile so that they would know what his will for them was. But he also sent prophets because they didn't always follow his will. Even after the judgment that he brought against the northern and the southern kingdoms, they still did not always line up with the will of God. So God had to continue to send them prophets. What sections of the biblical text cover the time period of the minor prophets? It'd be 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 23 through chapter 25 and verse 30, and then 2 Chronicles chapter 26 through Ezra and Nehemiah. And you don't necessarily have to read all of that, but again, look at your lesson material, and if you have time, read the most relevant sections. It will be helpful. And what general historical periods do the following prophets fit? And this is just kind of an exercise in using the chart. Well, Amos prophesied during the period of the divided kingdom. Malachi prophesied during the time of the return of the righteous remnant. And then Habakkuk prophesied during the period of the divided kingdom as well. So what you see then is that the prophets were doing their work through different periods of religious history. He then asked that you give 2 of the 4 elements seen in the work of the prophets of God. He lists 4 elements on pages 10 and 11 at the bottom right-hand corner of page 10. I just want to read through those real quick. So these are some of the benefits to be derived from a study of these books. Number 1, the prophet taught the people to trust in God's mercy and salvation and not in their own strength or human allies. One thing you'll notice frequently in the books of prophecy, the Jews would rely either upon themselves or they'd go to Egypt. It was quite often they would go to Egypt. Things are getting bad. Enemies are getting strong. Let's just go to Egypt. You know, they'll help us. Well, God warned against that. When life gets tough, here's a lesson for us. When life gets tough, do you go to Egypt or do you go to God? Do you rely upon yourself? Do you rely upon the world? Or do you rely upon God? Secondly, the prophet reminded the people that a blessed life was conditioned on their faithfulness to the covenant of God, which necessitated submitting the whole heart to God in devoted obedience to his will. Well, that's true today. You know, if we want to maintain covenant fellowship with God, we must not become spiritual adulteresses, which is what they became. And that's going to be brought out, especially in the book of Hosea, that we'll begin in just a moment. Number 3, the prophet gave hope for the future for those who put their hope or their trust in God. And then number 4, the prophet pointed to fulfilled prophecy as the seal of divine authority on their words. And again, this is just one of the evidences of inspiration. The things that the prophets said would happen did happen, and that's an evidence of inspiration. Any comments or question on the introduction? Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Well, it's arranged by subject matter, like the Pentateuch. You know, that's the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which is basically the law of Moses and was written by Moses. And then you have the major prophets, the minor prophets. You have the period of the United Kingdom, the period of the divided kingdom. You know, perhaps we would like to have, in those books that deal with the divided kingdom, we would like to take the books of prophecy that pertain to that period and kind of stick them somewhere in there. But, you know, I guess God chose not to do it that way, and it becomes a challenge for us, but it's something that's very doable, is to know about the history and what's going on, and then study that book of prophecy with that history in mind. Okay, let's look at the book of Hosea now. We'll start in chapter 1. The word of the Lord which came to Hosea the son of Beeri during the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. Now, something that's important to note here. This Jeroboam is not the first Jeroboam. This is Jeroboam the second. If you go back and look at that chronological chart, you'll see that there's a Jeroboam who was the first king, and then years later there was another king with the same name. It was a time of prosperity. It was a time when the northern kingdom was enjoying good times economically. But those times were coming to an end, and as is so often the case, during periods of economic prosperity, what do people do? They forget God. Who needs God when the stock market's going out the roof? Who needs God when I got plenty of money in the bank? Who needs God when I never suffer economic hardship? And that's what we see in the northern kingdom. Hosea was sent to the northern kingdom. Verse 2, when the Lord first spoke through Hosea. So is the book of Hosea the word of the Lord? Okay, that's what he says, isn't it? Look for that, all right? When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go, take to yourself a wife of harlotry and have children of harlotry, for the land commits flagrant harlotry. The people were unfaithful to God. God chose them to be His people. God wanted a special relationship with them, but they were unfaithful to God. God is going to use Hosea's life. He is going to use his marriage as an object lesson for the people. Now, I don't believe when God said to go and take yourself a wife of harlotry, that Gomer, who was his wife, was a harlot. I think this is looking forward to what she would become, and God would know that. Also, when God first chose the Jews, they were not unfaithful. They became unfaithful. And so this would better serve to illustrate the relationship between God and his people if Hosea married a woman who would in time become unfaithful to her husband. And she would have children of harlotry. I believe what that means is that these were not going to be Hosea's children. They would be children of other men. forsaking the Lord. Verse 3, so he went and he took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore a son. This would be his child. And the Lord said to him, name him Jezreel, for yet a little while, and I will punish the house of Jehu for the bloodshed of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. Now, Jehu was one of the kings that God used to punish other wicked kings. But what Jehu did was go too far. He went way beyond what God expected of him. He sort of came to enjoy killing. Let's put it that way. And so what God is doing here is he's going to punish the people. And he's naming these children so as to look forward to that period of punishment. He says, I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. Verse 5, on that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. Verse 6, then she conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. And the Lord said to him, name her Lo-Ruhamah. What does Lo-Ruhamah mean? She has not obtained compassion. For I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel. God's a God of mercy. He's a God of love. He's a God of passion. But he's also a God of law. He's a just God. He's a holy God. And he's a God who expects his people to be in submission to his will. That I would ever forgive them. Verse 7, but I will have compassion on the house of Judah and deliver them by the Lord their God, and will not deliver them by bow, sword, battle, horses, or horsemen. Now, I think that had an immediate fulfillment and a long-term fulfillment. The immediate fulfillment would be when the angel would be sent to slay 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in one night during the time of King Hezekiah. The long-term fulfillment would be in Christ. God would deliver his people from the bondage of sin, not through physical warfare, but through the death of Christ on the cross. Verse 8, when she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, she conceived and gave birth to a son. And the Lord said, name him Lo-Ammi. What does Lo-Ammi mean? Not my people. For you are not my people, and I am not your God. Yet the number of the sons of Israel, the word yet carries a powerful punch. You're going to be judged. You've been unfaithful. But here's a message of hope. Yet the number of the sons of Israel will be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And in the place where it is said to them, you are not my people, it will be said to them, you are the sons of the living God. Does that have reference to the time of Messiah? Does that have reference to the time of Messiah? It's cited in Romans chapter 9. We actually see, and when we get to the end of chapter 2, if you look at chapter 2 and verse 23, I will sow her for myself in the land. I will also have compassion on her who had not obtained compassion. And I will say to those who were not my people, you are my people, and they will say, you are my God. Now turn to the passage Nick referenced, Romans chapter 9, verse 25. And what is the book of Romans about? It's about justification by faith in Jesus and not works of the law. Jew and Gentile both would be saved through Christ. You'll see in verse 25 of Romans chapter 9, as he says also in Hosea, I will call those who were not my people, and her who was not beloved, beloved. And it shall be that in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God. So we have definite proof that that was a messianic passage. Is everybody with me? If it's quoted in the New Testament and it's applied in reference to salvation by faith through Jesus, and we find it in an Old Testament book of prophecy, we know that is a reference to the Messiah. Does that make sense? All right, look at 1 Peter chapter 2. Someone read 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 10. Okay, again, that's from the book of Hosea. And Peter is writing to Christians living under the new covenant. So Hosea was speaking of the kingdom yet to be established. Any comments or questions? And the sons of Judah and the sons of Israel will be gathered together, and they will appoint for themselves one leader, and they will go up from the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. Exactly. Yeah, and one thing that you see in these books of prophecy too, God speaks to them in their language. He doesn't just come out and say, this is a reference to Jesus, who's going to establish the church on the day of Pentecost, and the people who are going to be a member of that church will hear, believe, confess, repent, and be baptized for the remission of their sins. Yeah, and if God had put it in those terms, well, that had no idea what he was talking about. You know, he speaks of a time of peace in the kingdom of Christ as being a time when people can sit under shade trees. You know, he puts it in a language, not a language, but he uses language that they can understand. Does that make sense? All right, let's look at chapter 2. Say to your brothers, because this is a continuation of the thoughts of verses 10 and 11 in chapter 1. Say to your brothers, Ami, and to your sisters, Ruhamah. So it's going from Lo Ami and Lo Ruhamah to Ami and Ruhamah. What does Ami mean? My people. What does Ruhamah mean? Mercy, or she has obtained compassion. So this is where they would be, that is, those who would have faith in Christ years later under the Messiah. So what good is this for the Jews living during the time of Jeroboam II and Hezekiah? What good is this for them? I agree. But let's dig down a little bit. How can it be encouraging when it's something that's going to happen hundreds of years in the future? You know, if your life is an absolute mess, and I say, well, cheer up. Things are going to be good 500 years from now. Does that make you feel good? Yeah, and what does the New Testament teach us about the blood of Christ? It goes back and covers the sins committed by those who lived under the old covenant. Now, how's that? Well, it's through the eyes of faith. You know, regardless of where you're at in God's scheme of redemption, the basis of salvation is the same. Don't misunderstand it. What's the basis of salvation? Regardless of whether you're living under the old covenant, the new covenant, or prior to the old covenant. What's the basis of salvation? It's faith. It's faith. Regardless of where you're living in human history. So when the northern kingdom was crumbling, when it was falling apart, when the Assyrians were driving spikes through people and dragging them by chains, you're going to be saved by faith. If you're living during the first century, you're going to be saved by faith. If you're living in the second century and you're suffering Roman persecution, And it appears that there's nothing good about this time. You're saved by faith and your hope of eternal life. Today, if we're experiencing a time of political turmoil or human suffering, what good is it to know that, and we don't know when the Lord's going to return. It could be 2,000 years from now. It could be tomorrow. It could be the next 30 seconds. But not really knowing, what good is that to you now? Well, it's the same benefit to you that it was to them. It's to know that I'm saved by faith, I walk by faith, I live by trust, and I'm seeking a city not made with hands, but a city that's made by God. Okay, verse 2. Contend with your mother. Now this is God speaking through Hosea, to Hosea. Contend with your mother, contend. For she is not my wife. We're back to the present. And I am not her husband. And let her put away her harlotry from her face and her adultery from between her breasts. Or I will strip her naked and expose her as on the day when she was born. I will also make her like a wilderness, make her like desert land, and slay her with thirst. This is the language of judgment. It's the language of punishment that was going to come upon the northern kingdom. Also, I will have no compassion on her children, because they are children of harlotry. For their mother has played the harlot. She who conceived them has acted shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers. Think of a harlot. Who give me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink. Now, what the people did in worshiping idols is attribute to those idols the source of their physical blessings. They forgot who gave them what they needed to live. And so they began worshiping the gods and the goddesses of fertility, believing that Baal was the source of rain, Baal was the source of the harvest, Baal was the source of children. They believed that he was the source, the pagan gods were the source, so they took all that God had blessed them with and they used that to worship the pagan gods. Just like a harlot engages in harlotry based on what she's going to, for lack of a better way of putting it, get out of the deal. Well, that's the way they looked at the pagan gods, and that was how they lost their relationship with God. She will pursue her lovers, verse 6. Therefore, behold, I will hedge up her way with thorns, and I will build a wall against her so that she cannot find her paths. She will pursue her lovers, but she will not overtake them. She will seek them, but will not find them. Then she will say, I will go back to my first husband, for it was better for me then than now. So God is going to have to punish the people to purge them of their sin. It would be the punishment that would serve to bring them back to God. For she does not know, verse 8, that it was I who gave her the grain, the new wine, and the oil, and lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal. Therefore I will take my grain at harvest time and my new wine in its season. I will also take away my wool and my flax, given to cover her nakedness. And then I will uncover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and no one will rescue her out of my hand. When the Jews were being taken into Assyrian captivity, what did the other nations say about them? Wow, those are God's people. This is the chosen nation. Look at what's happening to them. Their sinfulness was being exposed. Verse 11, I will also put an end to all her gaiety, her feasts, her new moons, her Sabbaths, and all her festal assemblies. And I will destroy her vines and fig trees, of which she said, these are my wages, which my lovers have given me. And I will make them a forest, and the beasts of the field will devour them. I will punish her for the days of the Baals, when she used to offer sacrifices to them, and adorn herself with her earrings and jewelry, and follow her lovers, so that she forgot me, declares the Lord. Therefore, behold, I will allure her, bring her into the wilderness, and speak kindly to her. Then I will give her her vineyards from there, and the valley of Achor as a door of hope. And she will sing there as in the days of her youth, as in the day when she came up from the land of Egypt. God's going to bring them out. There's going to be a righteous remnant. It's years in the future, but there's going to be a righteous remnant through whom the Messiah would come. It will come about in that day, verse 16 declares the Lord, that you will call me Ishai. What does that mean? My husband. And will no longer call me Baali, my master. For I will remove the names of the Baals from her mouth, so that they will be mentioned by their names no more. In that day I will also make a covenant for them. Now listen to the language here. This is life with Jesus. I will make a covenant with the beasts of the field, the birds of the sky, and the creeping things of the ground. And I will abolish the bow, the sword, and war from the land, and I will make them lie down in safety. What's he speaking of here? Peace. Peace and spiritual prosperity. Did that not just jump right out at you? I will betroth you to me forever. Yes, I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in loving kindness and in compassion, and I will betroth you to me in faithfulness. Then you will know the Lord. Now, if you're struggling with getting excited about this, let me just put it this way. He's writing about us. When he's speaking of these future blessings, maybe it wasn't such an encouragement to them, but it should be an encouragement to us, because we're living in that time of blessing. And he was speaking of it hundreds of years ago. It will come about, verse 21, in that day that I will respond, declares the Lord. I'll respond to the heavens, and they will respond to the earth, and the earth will respond to the grain, to the new wine, and to the oil, and they will respond to Jezreel. I will sow her for myself in the land. I will also have compassion on her, who had not obtained compassion. And I will say to those who are not my people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my God. God will rain down spiritual blessings. We have been blessed with every blessing, spiritual blessing in the heavenly places. Comments or questions? It's so silent in here, I can hear my ears ringing. Anybody?
Do you think what's going on today is part of this now?
I think the fact that you are walking in spiritual prosperity, which is going on right now, is what this is about. Does that make sense? I think the fact that I can pray to God and know that Jesus is my high priest, sitting at the right hand of God, making intercession for me, is blessing and life under the new covenant. It's a period of blessing about which the prophet was speaking to people who are being judged for their sinfulness. But he's giving the righteous remnant hope. You know, some of the people who went into captivity were not bad people. Some of the people who experienced the fall of Jerusalem, maybe some of them died. They weren't all bad people. And God was speaking to them, and he was giving them hope to know that someday there's going to be this period of spiritual prosperity, and you're going to be in a place. You're going to be in a better place than where you're at right now if you'll just maintain your faithfulness. Comments, questions?
Other nations could see
what,
Other nations could see it with God, and you couldn't.
yeah. Yeah, that's well said. And we see what happens when, even in our time, when we live in sin, we bring shame and reproach upon God's people. And that's why we will suffer the consequences of those sins, is because we become that stumbling block. Okay, I think that's the second bell. We'll pick up with chapter 3 next week, and then we'll move on into the